There is no document in the world that has been analyzed by anybody as much as the Talmud has, the Babylonian Talmud. There are literally millions of books that the Chachmei Israel, the wise men of Israel, the greatest minds in history, have written about the Talmud. Because the Talmud is the foundation of our oral Torah. Everything is built on top of it, all of the things that we have, so much so that without the written Torah, we still have Judaism. But without the Talmud, we don't have Judaism, because we won't know how to interpret the written Torah without the Talmud. We won't know how to interpret the laws without the Talmud. Everything is in the Talmud. And all of the books that are written until this day, if they're considered real Torah wisdom, their primary source is the Talmud. Anyone that is delving into the world of halacha has to go into the Talmud, even though we don't paskin from the Talmud, because the Psak Halacha was already made by the early sages 900 years ago, but you still have to look at all of the different back and forth arguments that were had in order to look at all of the possibilities before you go into and reviewing all of the opinions of the early sages, and before you go into the final conclusion. The Talmud has been analyzed, reviewed in so many different ways. You literally have millions of books that were written by the smartest men that ever lived. More than anything else, everything has been fact-checked, everything has been compared, where if, let's say, for example, there were some bad people that tried to change any part of the Torah, whether the written Torah or the oral Torah, at some point this would show up in the Talmud, where everything has been analyzed, reanalyzed, and so on. Now, of course, there have been printer errors from time to time, but nothing to the extent that it was so material, where you saw that these things were intentionally removed in order to change things, in order to deceive people intentionally. The more a person learns the Talmud, the more they understand that not only is this authentic, but this is divine, because there is information in the Talmud that no human being could have thought of. So the more a person learns the Talmud, the more they learn how to think like a Jew, and most importantly, the more they understand where the sages stand and where they do. And typically the people that speak against the Talmud or speak against the Zohar Kadosh are people that have never read it. When somebody says, I only believe in the written Torah, I don't believe in the oral Torah, you really want to make sure that this person is instituted in some place, unless they're willing to start learning, because you do not understand a single verse in the Torah without the oral Torah, because it's not legible without the oral Torah. So again, that oral Torah is constantly connected to the Talmud. The Midrashim are constantly feeding off of the Talmud. The Zohar is constantly feeding off of the Talmud. Everything feeds off of it. It's the same oral Torah. So everything feeds off of each other and adds, and so, because there's no work, there's no body of work aside from the 5 books of Moses, the Tanakh itself, that feeds off of itself. Meaning that every book that we have in the oral Torah, whether it's the Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, the Zohar, the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, the Ramban, the Tu, anybody, any work that you have, none of it, all the Kabbalah books, nothing is just by itself. Meaning, it's just one sage writing a bunch of stuff. There is no such thing. Every single book that was accepted among Am Yisrael as a valid Torah source is a book that is constantly referencing the other parts of the oral Torah as their source. You can't just decide, oh listen, I'm going to write a commentary on the Chumash today. I'm going to read the verses of the written Torah and I'm going to decide what they mean. There is no such thing. No one with a brain will actually pick up such a book. The Christians do it all the time, but that's because that's how they read everything. They read everything based on logic. That's also the reason why their religion changes every decade. If somebody wants to know what to write in their book, let's say you want to write a book that's full of Torah, you can't come up with just your own opinion because you thought it. You have to have a source, a valid source that itself has a valid source, that itself has a valid source, all the way to the sages of the Talmud, that it themselves have their source all the way to the Matan Torah in Mount Sinai. That's how our Torah is. If there's a book that's published today that does not do that, it's not considered Torah. It's something that's no different than a newspaper. You could throw it in the garbage. You could even do other interesting things in the bathroom with it, like clean yourself or something. It's not worth anything. Why? Because our Torah has a heritage. The heritage has to connect all the way to Mount Sinai. So because there is a constant connection to the original source, there is an endless review of the sources. There is no body of work that has been reviewed more intensely, with more scrutiny, with more geniuses than the Talmud. Nothing is compared to it. Because every single Jewish book ever written has to use it as a source. Therefore, forcing every single person that is a chacham to review, and many times have to compare, because there are times that they found that there was a printer error, because the printing machines weren't the same as they are today back then. So there would be printing errors, and they would see. And you will sometimes see commentary bottom of a Talmud. If you, let's say, use an Art Scroll or some other publishers, you'll see, yes, this is the version we have, but there is a different version that has this specific word on it. Meaning that everyone knows what else is there. Meaning, since it's not something that you could just consider it irrelevant, we have to note it. Okay, so the Vilna Shas has this particular word, but the other Shas has a different word. And we note it. And everything is constantly compared, which is in essence another testifying evidence that whatever change or so-called corruption could have happened is already discovered, is already well noted and acknowledged, and so on.